Silas Hadley had lived in Moonfall Hamlet his entire life, save for a brief excursion to the city when he was an apprentice tinker. He often told people that the bustle of city life had made him long for the quieter rhythm of his birthplace. The hamlet itself was tucked away in a gentle valley, surrounded by rolling hills dotted with sheep. A small stream wound through the village, passing the weathered stone cottages and the dusty old chapel that shimmered with ancient legends. Here, Silas spent his days repairing everything from squeaky door hinges to broken pocket watches. The villagers adored him for his gentle spirit and nimble hands, and they trusted him, for if anyone could breathe new life into old trinkets, it was Silas. When Miss O'Day, the hamlet's historian, came to him with a peculiar request, Silas's curiosity was piqued. She explained that the towering clock atop the old belfry had been silent for decades. Local law held that it had stopped at the very moment the last member of the fabled Harrington family had passed away, leaving the estate behind in some mysterious disrepair. But now there was renewed interest in that silent sentinel. Rumour had it an eccentric descendant of the Harrington line might be returning to claim the old manor on the far side of the hamlet. Miss O'Day, busy archiving antique manuscripts, wanted the clock to be in working order in case the rumoured arrival stirred fresh excitement in the hamlet. Delighted by the challenge, Silas happily agreed to take a look. On a crisp autumn morning, Silas climbed the rickety steps leading to the belfry. Each wooden plank groaned underfoot. Dust swirled in golden beams of sunlight and stirred a cacophony of motes that danced like fairies around him. At the top he found the clockworks, a tangle of rusted gears and metal rods. Many of the components had decayed, some were missing altogether. Silas scoffed at the immensity of the task, but felt a surge of eagerness. He also couldn't help but note that this belfry exuded a certain presence. An unspoken hush weighed upon the rafters. He wiped the grime from the clock face's inner panel and examined the archaic notation. The inscriptions and symbols etched onto the metal and wood looked unlike any standard design he'd seen before. He suspected the Harrington family must have commissioned a custom craftsman of exceptional skill. That felt almost certain when he spotted tiny runes hidden between the main gear and some sort of hammer mechanism intended to strike the bell. Fascinated, he catalogued these odd details in his mind, planning to ask Miss O'Day what she knew about their origin. For now, he set about removing broken parts and replacing them with new or refurbished ones. At midday, he paused to eat a sandwich, letting the cool breeze of autumn brush across his face as he surveyed the village below. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, Silas had scrubbed each working piece clean. He fit gear upon gear, tested the tension in the springs, adjusted the escapement, and finally reattached the elongated pendulum that would help regulate time. He looked at his handiwork with pride, but a slight chill tingled his spine when he touched the dark metal rods connecting the hammer to the bell. He simply shrugged the feeling off. This was, after all, a place thick with dust and shadow. If he let every shiver of imagination get to him, he would never get any work done. Satisfied for the day, he packed up and descended the steps, deciding the final tests could wait for the morning light. On the way home, he heard faint echoes in the wind, a whisper, or perhaps just the breeze navigating the stones. That night, Silas dreamt of gears turning, and a bell ringing at some ungodly hour. He awoke in a cold sweat, his half-open window letting in the darkest hours of night, illuminated by the faint glimmer of moonlight. Early the next morning, he returned to the belfry to complete his adjustment. When he turned the clock's key for a final time, the array of gears began moving in perfect, if silent, unison. The bell's hammer rose, preparing to test the new alignment. Then, at precisely 8 o'clock, it renewed its voice in a sonorous clang that reverberated through the hamlet. Birds startled off rooftops, and residents paused in the street, listening to the clock's triumphant return. Silas grinned. All appeared to be in order. But barely a day later, The first odd occurrence manifested. At precisely 2 in the afternoon, just as Silas was finishing lunch, the clock began to ring. Childlike curiosity propelled him to check his watch. He found it was off by the traditional chiming schedule. Clearly, the hour was not at the top of the clock. Yet ring it did. A single, resounding note that turned more than a few heads around Moonfall Hamlet. The villagers shrugged it off as a small glitch in the newly restored mechanism. That night, however, at the improbable time of 2:13 IMM, the dreadful clang resounded again. This time it was a triple peal. Awakened from a deep sleep, Silas nearly jumped from his bed. He rubbed his eyes, stumbled to his window, and confirmed that the belfry was indeed lit up by the moonlight, no ghosts or intruders apparent, just an empty tower that shouldn't have been making a sound until the real hour struck. He tried to shrug it off, blaming an alignment error, but the uneasy feeling refused to be ignored. Curiosity turned to determination, and Silas resolved to climb back up the belfry in the morning, this time seeking assistance from Miss O'Day. They manoeuvred the creaking steps, one after the other, pausing every now and then to catch their breath in the dusty air. Near the top of the tower, Miss O'Day rummaged calmly through a leather satchel, producing an old parchment. "I came across this in the archives last night," she said in a hushed tone. "It's part of the Harrington family's records. Might help explain what's happening." They spread the parchment on a wooden ledge, reading by the filtered morning light. The delicate handwriting detailed a clockwork mystery that had been a subject of speculation even a century ago, mentioned that the clock had once rung at peculiar times prior to important events, sometimes calamities that befell the Harringtons, other times bizarre incidents across the hamlet. The page ended with a chilling last line. "Should it ring without reason, prepare for the curse's new season." Silas frowned, uncertain whether to believe in so-called curses or pay heed to old wives' tales. Still, he couldn't deny the clock's unusual behavior. Miss O'Day moved closer to the machinery, meticulously inspecting the runes Silas had discovered. She identified them as archaic sigils used in ceremonial magic centuries ago, though she admitted her knowledge was fragmented. If the clock truly had some ill enchantment, it had long gone dormant. Even if it appeared awake once more, it would take extensive research to understand it. That evening, Silas found himself restless. After dinner, he wandered around the perimeter of the Harrington Manor grounds, a place rarely visited in times past. Moonfall Hamlet's houses were modest, but the Harrington residence stood out like a relic of a different age. Stone gargoyles adorned the corners of its high roof, and windows were shuttered behind iron bars. Overgrown hedges and an impenetrable fence made it difficult to see much inside. A chilly wind rippled through the branches of spindly trees, causing them to rattle. He peered through a gap in the fence and glimpsed the silhouette of a decrepit fountain in the courtyard. There was silence, but for a single screech owl hollering in the distance. Suddenly the clock began to toll, a low, resonant moan that did not align to any hour or half-hour. He counted. 5 chimes, then a pause, then 2 more. Even from this distance, each note felt like a warning. He clutched the fence, his heart in his throat. In that moment, he thought he saw a figure move behind the upstairs window of the old manor. It was only for a split second, so fleeting he couldn't be sure if his eyes had played a trick on him. Spooked, he abandoned his vigil and returned home, plagued by more questions than answers. It was nearly dawn when Silas next spoke to Miss O'Day, explaining the mysterious figure and sharing his apprehension that the rumoured Harrington descendant might have already arrived in secret. She suggested consulting Patrick Billingham, a reclusive scholar known to dabble in family lineages. Patrick lived in a snug cottage near the stream, surrounded by piles of books and genealogical charts. He was kindly, though perpetually dishevelled, with ink-stained fingers and thinning hair that stood in odd angles. When Silas recounted the story, Patrick blinked in fascination. He promptly fetched a hefty tome from a crooked shelf. He turned pages with great care, running his finger down genealogical lines until he reached the Harrington name. According to this, he said, the last of the known Harringtons died nearly 50 years ago. No official record mentions an heir, but as he flipped backward in time, he found footnotes referencing an illegitimate branch of the family, rumored to have lived in secrecy abroad. A note scrawled in the margin read, "They say the clock is bound to the family's fate. Time moves strangely for the cursed Harrington blood." Though these cryptic notations didn't definitively prove anything, they did spark an idea. If there was an heir in Moonfall Hamlet, he or she might be drawn to the awakened clock as moth to flame. Silas resolved to keep vigilant, offering to meet Miss O'Day late that night for a clandestine watch near the manor's grounds. The two of them tucked themselves beside a row of wild bramble, each wrapped in thick cloaks to ward off the chill. A lantern was hidden beneath a gauze of cloth, so as not to attract attention. Hours crawled by, and the clock underwent several legitimate rings. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Nothing unusual, until, out of the blue, a single gong rolled across the misty air, reverberating in the hollow hush between them. It was well before 3 by their reckoning. Heart-pounding, Silas peered between the brambles, just in time to see a flicker of light behind the manor's shuttered windows. What followed was stranger still. A tall figure emerged from the manor's side door, stepping across the weed-choked path as though searching for something. Silas couldn't make out details of the person's face, but the silhouette suggested lanky limbs and a purposeful gait. The figure strolled across the courtyard, lantern held high, revealing a battered trunk or chest resting near the fountain. Then, with remarkable care, the figure opened it and pulled out what looked like a large book. The clock marked another inappropriate chime, this time 2 strikes. The figure froze, then hurried back into the house, trunk and book in tow. The courtyard returned to darkness. Shaken, Miss O'Day and Silas retreated to her house, where they sipped hot tea to steady their nerves. Together, they theorized that whatever was being kept in that trunk might be tied to the clock's curse. Some ancient family grimoire, or ledger perhaps. If the figure was indeed a Harrington descendant, they must have come to reclaim more than just a decrepit mansion. They were awaking something best left dormant. Miss O'Day resolved to research more on the sigils carved into the clock. Silas decided to stealthily investigate the manor further the next day, hoping for a chance to speak with this mysterious newcomer, but the following morning the hamlet was thrown into a fervour. At precisely 9:30 in ordinary time, to be sure, the clock emitted a cacophony of bells as if it were summoning the entire village. Searching for the cause, villagers found that the main street had partially flooded, the small stream surging inexplicably. Margot, the local baker, claimed the clock's sudden outburst was a premonition of the floodwaters. Meanwhile, children, spooked by the unpredictability, said it was the beginning of a real curse. Silas, disturbed by the talk, hurried into the belfry. The machinery looked perfect. Not a single gear was out of place. He tested the alignment, feeling a gnawing unease. "Nothing is amiss," he muttered, baffled. Upon descending, he found Miss O'Day waiting anxiously. Together, they decided a direct confrontation was necessary. The outlandish nature of these events, phantom rings, strange sightings, and bizarre floods, was growing dangerous. That evening, a dusky sky glowed red above the hamlet, an omen of rough weather. Silas approached the manor's iron gates. Miss O'Day accompanied him up the winding drive. They half expected a caretaker, or perhaps the tall stranger, to appear and bar their way, but no one emerged as they crept around to a side entrance. The door was locked, but Miss O'Day discovered that one of the window shutters hung loose. Silas carefully prized it open and slid through the gap, helping Miss O'Day follow. Inside, rotted floorboards creaked at every step, and cobwebs swathed corners in dusty shrouds. The corridor stretched ahead with closed doors on either side. The pair's lantern cast wavering shadows on peeling wallpaper. Far off at the end of the hall, a faint glimmer indicated someone else was present. Heart thumping, they crept closer until they reached a small library. Rows of books lined the walls, some spines deteriorated beyond repair. The tall figure was there, facing away from them. He clutched a large tome bound in faded leather, muttering words in a hushed, urgent tone. Attempting composure, Silas cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he whispered, his voice slicing through the dusty stillness. The figure spun around. By the lantern's glow they saw a gaunt face, pale and stern. Dark hair fell around sharp cheekbones, and grey eyes glimmered with something akin to desperation. "Who are you?" The stranger's voice was low and rattled with tension. Silas introduced himself as the hamlet's tinker and caretaker of the old clock. Next to him, Miss O'Day offered a polite bow, introducing herself as the local historian. They asked whether this person might be a Harrington. A single nod gave them the answer. His name, as he revealed, was Alistair Harrington. Alistair seemed torn between indignation at their intrusion and relief at having someone with whom to share his burden. He parted from the large tome, revealing pages filled with circular diagrams and archaic incantations. "I knew the clock had been restored," he said, uncertain. "I came to stop the curse from spreading any further." Miss O'Day and Silas exchanged startled glances. Alistair explained that he was descended from a distant branch of the Harrington family. His grandmother had left the hamlet for good reason. She spoke of a clock bound by an old family curse, meant to herald terrible events. "The saddest blow," Alistair confided, was that the curse was self-perpetuating, requiring the presence of a Harrington in the manor along with the clock's operation to awaken its malevolence. Perhaps, he had hoped, if the family line returned to the manor and performed a ritual shown in the tome, they could sever the old ties. But since the clock had been repaired, each midnight brought new complications. He didn't realize the curse would begin sounding at random times, threatening the entire hamlet. He showed them a dusty page describing a summoning of protective forces to quell the malicious energies in objects burdened by hatred or sorrow. According to the text, under the next full moon, a Harrington descendant could attempt a cleansing ceremony with the physical source of the curse, that is, the clock's central gear mechanism, apparently embedded with symbolic runes. Alarmed, Silas realized he had seen those runes. "We can bring the gear here," he suggested, "but only under safe conditions. The belfry is too open to the public." After more discussion, Alistair agreed. They decided they would remove the central gear from the clock during the final hour before midnight and bring it to the manor for the ritual. Miss O'Day, as a historian well versed in local law, would help interpret the incantation. Silas, of course, would handle the metal parts. Alistair described how they must gather certain items: a silver basin, fresh water from the hamlet's stream, the same that had inexplicably flooded, and sprigs of rosemary for purification. It was arranged to meet on the evening of the full moon, which was only 3 nights away. Those days passed in a rush, an air of mingled fear and anticipation filling the hamlet. Meanwhile, the clock continued its erratic chiming. 1 ring in the middle of an afternoon, 4 rings at dawn, and so on. Whispers spread among villagers that the Harrington curse was real, and they ought never to have repaired the old clock. Silas endured sideway glances, but most of the hamlet's residents trusted him. They believed he wouldn't let the village come to harm. On the designated night, clouds drifted across the moon, painting the belfry's silhouette in a ghostly manner. Silas and Miss O'Day ascended the tower at 11 o'clock. The machinery glinted in the moonlight. With cautious efficiency, Silas removed the gear. Its metal surface was etched with shifting patterns, so subtle that they nearly appeared alive. Miss O'Day cradled it in a cloth, and they hurried back down, crossing the hamlet to reach Alistair at the manor. Inside the dilapidated library, they found a space cleared of dust. A circle of white chalk formed the ritual ring. Alistair placed the silver basin in the centre, poured in the stream water, and scattered rosemary around the border. Silas carefully set the gear into the basin, Alistair began chanting in a trembling voice, while Miss O'Day followed, reading from the tome in soft whispers and helping him pronounce the more obscure phrases. The air crackled, as though charged by static. The temperature dipped perceptibly, and gusts of wind rattled shutters across the house. As the chanting intensified, the gear began to glow with a faint, ethereal light. Silas's heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Alistair repeated the closing lines, each syllable resonating off the dusty walls. Then, with startling suddenness, the entire basin rattled, sloshing water onto the floor. A muffled bell sound seemed to echo in Silas's head, though it was not coming from outside. It was as if the clock's resonance had been transposed into the metal itself. All at once, the glow drained away. A hush fell over the library. Alistair lifted the gear from the basin, no longer warm or brimming with eerie luminescence. For several moments no one spoke. The wind outside slowed, and the entire house felt strangely lighter, as though relieved of some suffocating weight. Miss O'Day exhaled her tension. Silas released a breath he didn't know he was holding. They stepped out into the manor's courtyard. The moon shone fully through a break in the clouds, revealing that the once overgrown garden no longer seemed so menacing. Even the gargoyles overhead appeared less foreboding. In the distance, the silent belfry loomed. Silas wasn't certain if the next hour would ring properly, but in that moment, a renewed sense of calm settled over him. Early the next morning, Silas returned the gear to the clock. He adjusted it carefully, triple-checking each pivot, spring, and screw. A minute before 9 o'clock, the mechanism sounded its gears, whirling with perfect fluidity. Then, at precisely 9, a gentle chime wafted out across the hamlet. An unhurried, welcoming tone that set birds stirring in the trees and drew neighbors to their doors in relief. Minute after minute passed, and the expected series of chimes resumed, each hour without interruption. For a few days, tension lingered in Moonfall Hamlet. People braced themselves each time they heard the bell announce the hour, expecting another odd anomaly. Yet it never came. Day after day, the clock simply tolled when it was supposed to, reaffirming the natural order. Some villagers asked Silas if he had truly vanquished a curse. He simply offered a modest smile, stating he'd only repaired the clockwork. He confessed with a twinkle in his eye that Alistair Harrington had likely done the rest. Alistair chose to remain quietly at the manor for a short while, using what little funds he had to refit the house into a modest dwelling. He admitted to Silas and Miss O'Day that his future in Moonfall Hamlet was uncertain. Carrying the weight of the Harrington name was no simple matter, but the curse at least seemed lifted, and the strange hold that old clock had on the family's fate had broken. Before he departed for an extended trip abroad, hoping to discover more about his ancestry, he expressed his gratitude. He hoped that in time the Harrington legacy might be remembered not for its curse, but for its redemption. With the clock once again part of everyday life, villagers went about their routines. The blacksmith hammered horseshoes in time with the chimes at midday. Children scampered home at sundown when they heard the 6 o'clock tune. Farmers rose enthusiastically at dawn, counting on the first ringing to greet the morning. Silas would look up at the belfry with quiet pride, recalling the arduous weeks of mystery and dread. He believed that even the oldest curses could be undone with perseverance, generosity, and a bit of tinkering magic. On an evening stroll, Silas found himself walking past the manor once more. Its iron gates were open, the yard tidier, though still in need of care. No mysterious silhouettes roamed the windows anymore. Instead, the barest glow hinted at a handful of new lanterns within. He paused to admire the transformation. Somewhere deep within those walls, a legacy of sorrow and secrecy was giving way to cautious hope. As the clock began to chime the half-hour, its gentle echo rang across the hills, a warm and comforting presence. Silas tipped his hat to the stately building before turning homeward, content that, for now at least, Moonfall Hamlet's nights would remain quiet and untroubled. And in that hush, a new page of history opened, free from the ticking shadows of a clockwork curse.